Friedrich Nietzsche. The intoxicated thinker who lived music as intensively as he contemplated it transformed both philosophy and music culture with his poetic aphorisms and hammering thoughts about the origin of music. A man striving for ethical development through a form of self-overcoming, drawing from the very same source that challenged him with illness and temptation. Without music, life would be a mistake. Nietzsche, who wrote these words in one of his latest works, Götzendämmerung, Twilight of the Idols, underwent a dramatic transformation in his relationship to music. Before we dive into Nietzsche's complex relationship with music, I should acknowledge the key sources that additionally guided this exploration, since reading Nietzsche closely and openly presents unique interpretive and ideological challenges.
Der Wille zur Macht dient den Nazis zur Verherrlichung des Herrenmenschentums. Eine Propaganda, die brutale Folgen haben wird. Aus diesen Aufzeichnungen hat sich Elisabeth frei bedient. Sie hat ganze Passagen verändert, verfälscht, ergänzt. Sie hat völlig neue Sinnzusammenhänge erzeugt, die nicht Nietzsches, sondern ihrer eigenen politischen Gesinnung entsprechen. Niemals hätte er das Werk so verfasst, wie es dann in seinem Namen gedruckt wurde.
Mit dieser Art Nietzsches zu denken, so sprunghaft, aphoristisch, kann man viel anstellen, wenn man das aus dem Kontext reißt. Also gerade bei dieser aphoristischen Form des Denkens ist es ganz besonders wichtig, dass man den Kontext berücksichtigt. Und wenn man den Kontext so radikal entstellt, wie sie das entstellt hat, dann kann man die Dinge natürlich, dann kann man den Übermenschen anders lesen. Klar, dann macht man plötzlich einen Verfechter des Germanentums draus. Und dann wird auch ein Freund der antisemitischen Bewegung draus. Nietzsche hat 100-mal geschrieben, was wäre der deutsche Geist, wenn wir den jüdischen Geist nicht hätten? Gar nichts. Das hat sie natürlich weggelassen. Und plötzlich ist Nietzsche ein Verfechter des germanischen Geistes. Nichts wollte er weniger, als für dieses neue Reich irgendwie herhalten müssen als Hofphilosoph.
Hitler weiß, was symbolisch wirklich wichtig ist. Vieles von dem, was in Elisabeth ein Nietzsche-Bild entwickelt hat, kann er mit leichter Verschiebung sehr gut für sich gebrauchen.
Die langfristige Wirkung liegt eben darin, dass sie eben doch einen großen Einfluss auf die Werkpolitik genommen hat und lange Zeit dafür gesorgt hat, dass Nietzsche selbst in seinen Schriften nicht wirklich verstanden werden konnte. Und in diesem Sinne ist sie eine Gestalt der deutschen Geistesgeschichte, von der man sich wünschen würde, sie hätte mit diesem Friedrich Nietzsche eigentlich gar nichts zu tun.
Professor Dr. Volker Gerhardt's authoritative biography, Friedrich Nietzsche, Professor Gerhardt as one of the leading Nietzsche experts today and whom I've ironically met in Germany here in a grocery store. I've also relied heavily on Nietzsche-Forschung Band 13 from Akademie Verlag titled Friedrich Nietzsche zwischen Musik, Philosophie und Ressentiment, which offers crucial insights into the intersection of music and philosophy in Nietzsche's thought with many different experts from different fields. To understand Nietzsche's view on music, it's actually essential to understand where he began his music philosophy journey and his first foundations. Nietzsche built his early understanding of music on the metaphysics of German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. In Schopenhauer's philosophy, the will, seen as the blind, irrational driving force of the worldly, is the cause of all suffering, but also the source of art itself, which can serve as temporary redemption from the will. Schopenhauer elevated specially music above all other arts for its direct expression of the will, a view that resonated deeply with Richard Wagner, the composer whose relationship with Nietzsche would prove to be one of philosophy's most intense and tragic partnerships. For the German Romantic composer Richard Wagner, Schopenhauer's concept of the will and asceticism, the rejection of the will as a path to redemption, was a core element, especially in Wagner's late work Parsifal, which we will examine in more detail later. Music therefore held a metaphysically privileged position, the most direct art form because it expressed the will without the detour through representations that other arts required. Nietzsche agreed to a large extent with the idea that music represents the will, although he makes a very subtle but important distinction, as he writes in the fragments. Will is the object of music, but not the origin of the same. This subtle but vital distinction will prove key to understanding Nietzsche's dramatic shift and metamorphosis in musical philosophy. But first and foremost, what is this will? What is this energy? How does music reveal that to us? Friedrich Nietzsche examines these fundamental questions in Die Geburt der Tragödie. The Birth of Tragedy, his first major work, can only be understood if one reads it also as a manifest for Richard Wagner's monumental cultural politics. This begins with a profound contemplation of the tragic connection between life and art. On one hand, the Apollonian, where he analyzes music as language and consequently the difference between music and logical concepts, represents the most important counterforce to the Dionysian, whose mechanisms he examined more closely, which transforms feelings into words and expressions. Dionysian music imitates the world will, which is why Nietzsche calls it the universal mirror of the world will. Instrumental music also falls under Dionysian music. What is decisive for this classification is always that it imitates the world will. Apollonian music only depicts the music of appearances. The musical imitation of, for example, birdsong is also clearly to be designed as Apollonian music.
So the first thing that we did, it was to try to translate in sound what is the feeling of an explosion related to sound.
A little bit more ready for a bit of an experiment, for a little bit something new and something unusual.
Furthermore, for Nietzsche, music is less specific than concepts, which is why music is more Dionysian than language. The fusion of both means leading logical Apollonian truth back to the original language of instinct and realizing a balance between appearance or semblance and truth. A particularly vivid illustration appears in Nietzsche fragment from early 1870, 2 years before the publication of The Birth of Tragedy. Music is a language capable of infinite clarification. Language only interprets through concepts, so empathy arises through the medium of thought. This sets a limit for it. This applies only to objective written language. Spoken language is sounding, and the intervals, rhythms, tempos, strength, and emphasis are all symbolic of the emotional content to be represented. All this belongs to music, but the greatest mass of feeling does not express itself through words. Also worth mentioning is how Nietzsche understood himself as a kind of inverted Platonist. While in Plato's world of ideas, which is also the world of concepts and thus unify the true, good and beautiful, like Plato, Nietzsche maintains that in a great work of art, the true, good and beautiful form a unity. Here, however, the difference in how Nietzsche views the artwork itself becomes apparent. Art as a concept, Kunst in German, Nietzsche is certainly familiar with its etymological origin, as künstlich in German means artificial, the illusory, like künstliche Intelligenz, artificial intelligence, and künstlerisch meaning artsy or artistic. Nietzsche therefore sees the true and good as radical opposites. For Plato, in the unity of true, good and beautiful, the word should always dominate music. For Nietzsche, music should dominate words. Ironically, about The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche later said that he would rather have it set to music and sung it, as the birth of the Dionysian artist is what is truly meant by the birth of music tragedy. So what or who represented for Friedrich Nietzsche the Dionysian subject?
Die eigentliche Erschließung für die Musik ist dann durch ein Erlebnis in Leipzig, wo er studiert hat, durch das Hören der Musik von Wagner gekommen. Das sollte man der Gerechtigkeit halber auch sagen, dass es Wagner gewesen ist, der ihn zu dieser Begeisterung für die Musik gebracht hat. Und er hat sofort die Verbindung hergestellt zwischen der Musik Wagners und der Philosophie Schopenhauers. Und das ist eben das, was ihn dann in den ersten Jahren seiner eigenständigen philosophischen Arbeit stark beschäftigt. Er sah in Wagner denjenigen, der ein Programm der Philosophie durch seine Musik erfüllt und zugleich eine Alternative schafft zum bloßen Denken.
To answer the question, what is music, for Nietzsche, one cannot avoid the question, what is Wagner? In Richard Wagner, Nietzsche believed initially he had found the modern Aeschylus, the composer who could restore the Dionysian spirit. As a 24-year-old professor, the relationship between Friedrich Nietzsche and Richard Wagner intensified heavily. Nietzsche would be a guest 22 times in Triebschen, a small town in Switzerland where Richard Wagner sought asylum. Nietzsche and Wagner conducted political aesthetic debates, played with the children, or ran errands for Cosima Wagner, Richard Wagner's wife. Wagner's compositional genius laid in exploring ambivalent and ambiguous moods anew from existing harmonic history, for example with the Tristan chord.
A gift from the Steinway factory to Richard Wagner in 1876.
To celebrate the beginning
of the festival?
Yeah. And would you let me just try and play the...
Of course.
The famous chord. I'm not going to do any more than that, but this chord here, I want you to explain why it's... It's the first chord of Tristan in the Prelude. But...
Yes.
I'm playing the Tristan chord on Wagner's own piano. I have to pinch myself to see that I'm not dreaming.
Yes, very important.
There it is.
The famous Tristan chord.
Well, come on with the other two
And then
notes.
you get this.
Oh, that's it. They're there on the E and the A flat. That's it.
Yes.
This chord, if someone was to look it up on Wikipedia, they'd find a huge entry just on this chord. What is it about this chord?
It's a chord of tension, of longing. Yeah. The first voice goes up, like you played, right?
That longing,
and the other voices go down. So this is depression. And this at the same time.
Wagner's chromatic innovations seem to embody Nietzsche's theory, the endless melody, the dissolution of traditional harmonic boundaries, the overwhelming emotional impact. This was music that seemed to speak directly from the metaphysical ground of existence. The circularly constructed motifs in Die Walküre, Der fliegende Holländer, Tannhäuser, Nietzsche not only heard these in the works of Wagner, but especially in dance movements, which during dance, similar to centrifugal force or on a roller coaster, leads to an increase in strength through the activated torque. Wagner appeared to have grasped this principle that music generated the drama, not vice versa. Wagner's artistic craftsmanship represented for many the Gesamtkunstwerk, the synthesis of arts that Greek tragedy had achieved, the absolute and complete art. This amalgamation of speech, melody, and musical quotation and sound gesture in Wagner, with his tendency towards self-encirclement in the work, this fascination would simultaneously become the subject of Nietzsche's criticism of Wagner, which would tear apart their relationship. Richard Wagner was also a follower of German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, whose projection theory was particularly prominent in Wagner's lifetime. Feuerbach's projection theory, which proposes God as a projection of human ideals, had certainly contributed to emphasizing Wagner's artistic staging of the divine, especially in The Ring des Nibelungen and Parsifal. Wotan from The Ring is not an almighty god, but rather a flawed ruler who fails by his own laws, a projection of human power and guilt conflicts. Parsifal, on the other hand, is not a Christian savior, but a symbolic redeemer who works through compassion, which is a human ideal. This gives us interesting context to Nietzsche's most well-known quote, "God is dead," which should perhaps not only be read as a triumph, but as a consequence of the exposure of God through science and also through possible human creation. Thus, also the interpretation that Wagner, who staged the divine as human projection so perfectly in his operas, was thereby indirectly contributing to the acceleration of God's death. Wagner as a person was plagued with an unholy alliance of narcissistic behavior and nationalistic tendencies, as the Germanist Peter André Bloch describes. Wagner possessed an egomaniacal approach in the dramaturgical appropriation of mythical Germanisms, which he politically related to the present in the celebration of old German feudal ideas that could later be easily exploited fascistically, while Nietzsche stood uncomprehendingly toward such generalizing ideas. And what was Nietzsche actually doing? Richard Wagner saw in Nietzsche primarily at the time, despite or perhaps because of the recognition of his philosophical and rhetorical talent, a propagandist for the Bayreuth Festival, and Nietzsche, so it seems at first, continued to play the role of the eloquent and lurid propagandist. However, the critical undertones in the praise of Wagner multiplied, especially the accusation that Wagner was an actor concerned with effectiveness. In August 1876, he apparently found the atmosphere of unreserved worship around Wagner so unbearable that he left without comment for several days and no longer participated in the festivals. He criticized the approach to Christianity as dishonesty, strictly rejected Wagner's anti-Semitism, and rigorously exposed the theatrical success-seeking of the composer. Nietzsche needed a long-term recovery from this traumatic Bayreuth Festival. Abstinence from Wagner's musical world and Bayreuth as the temple of the will to musical power thus belonged to his mental sensual diet program that he had prescribed for himself. So here comes the definitive transformation in how Nietzsche also understood music itself. Here his small distinction from Schopenhauer also comes to fruition. Will is the object of music, but not the origin of the same. So why don't they share the same origin according to Nietzsche? As Nietzsche writes, music is not immediate expressions of the will, but only in the fullness of art can it so appear. This confession reveals Nietzsche's most important principle that one can learn from aphoristic reading, the perspectival. Every being grasps from reality only its specific excerpt, a perspective, and this excerpt is the whole for it. similar to how the German philosopher Immanuel Kant tried to note as transcendental conditions. We do not understand reality as it is in itself, but always only as it appears to us. This in itself is the subject of discussion regarding Wagner also in Nietzsche's book Genealogy of Morals. Wagner now became an oracle, a priest, indeed more than a priest, a kind of mouthpiece of the in itself of things. A telephone of the beyond, he spoke henceforth not only music, this ventriloquist of God, he spoke metaphysics. Wagner had also learned to misuse Schopenhauer's thesis that music speaks like the language of the will directly for his purposes, music as a means. The Germanist Peter André Bloch describes this relationship further. The master served him long as a model, which later hindered him in his attempts to connect transcendental and immanent in the aesthetic through the creative power of developed mythologies, because these parodied his differentiated conception of the Übermensch by projecting it into Germanic prehistory, taking it back into the realm of the representable and thereby robbing it of part of its emancipatory visionary power. Nietzsche's perspectivism therefore also applied to his own musical nature. The very romanticism he criticized in Wagner lived within himself. Music is not immediate expression of the will, but only in the fullness of art can it so appear. Therefore, Nietzsche's new understanding of music's dialectical relationship to the plurality of arts marks the fall of music from metaphysical privilege, arguing ironically in an Hegelian dialectic to criticize a strongly anti-Hegelian Schopenhauer. Ich hasse euch! How Nietzsche also summarizes the entire musical development in a single historical overall process is close to the Hegelian idea of the Weltgeist, the world spirit. In the years 1876 to 77, Nietzsche thus transformed from Wagner's propagandist, from the self-appointed prophet of a new German culture, to a distanced psychologist who knows no mission but only the impulse for ruthless exposure. Another concept to explain the relationship between Nietzsche and Wagner in retrospect would be to examine psychoanalytical concepts by Sigmund Freud. Freud described through sublimation that libidinal force can transform into higher forms. Here with Nietzsche and Wagner, however, it seems like a kind of negative sublimation where renunciation of instinctual satisfaction transforms and renunciation itself becomes pleasure invested. Wagner, who was quite known for his pathological jealousy, especially in his anti-Semitic pamphlet of Judaism, where he incites anti-Semitic narratives against Mendelssohn, whom he had previously admired and whom he had adopted so much, is perhaps all the more a sign of this. The tragedy of perverted sublimation lies in the fact that once sublimation itself becomes the drive goal, it perverts itself and becomes destructive. Renunciation of desire becomes desire for renunciation, and this desire seeks new, often destructive forms of satisfaction. In the later years, when Nietzsche suffered from severe depression, he rewrote the preface of his first work, The Birth of Tragedy, in which he had dedicated his work to Wagner so dearly. Nietzsche writes in self-critique, "For all life rests on appearance, art, deception, optics, necessity of the perspectival, and of mistake." Wagner is then declared by Nietzsche as an artist of decadence who flees into intoxication and numbness, while Nietzsche sees himself as one suffering from the abundance of life, who wants Dionysian art and thus wants life. This is also why Nietzsche's fascination with Carmen grew, music that was light, Mediterranean, something cheerful and life-affirming. Wagner, on the other hand, he accuses of wanting redemption. Regarding life, they are both antipodes. Nietzsche's new definition of music became his means of emancipation from himself, not through renouncing his musical nature. As German literary scholar Rüdiger Görner notes, in musical enjoyment, the I detaches itself from the I, but it does not dissolve in Dionysian ecstasy. It should not lead merely to self-forgetfulness, but rather to a more Apollonian, bright self-contemplation. Philosophy itself became musical for the mature Nietzsche, thinking in time, developing themes through variation, creating meaning through relationship rather than substance. Without music, life would be a mistake. When Nietzsche wrote these words, they followed from a confession. I fear I am too much of a musician not to be a romantic. The Greeks wanted to discuss and argue with words, which doesn't work well with music. About music, one can hardly think cleanly. This is precisely music's gift. It focuses us into the realm of feeling and instinct, where the great mass of emotion expresses itself beyond words. Nietzsche discovered that music constitutes the fertile ground of mistakes itself, yet it's also capable of freeing us from mistakes. Like his own aphoristic method, music gains its meaning not from representing absolute truth, but from its capacity to generate new perspectives, new ways of experiencing life. In the end, Nietzsche became what he admitted in music, a creator of meaning through the interplay of form and freedom, precision and improvisation, depth and surface, a philosopher who thought musically and a musician of ideas. I'm giving away 2 tickets for Slavoj Žižek on September the 18th at 7:30 p.m. at Babylon Berlin. All you have to do is comment below with Nietzsche's date of death and whether you want 1 or 2 tickets, and you are in the pot. Registration closes on September the 4th at 7 p.m. German time. Winners will be notified via comment reply and must contact me via email within 24 hours after the announcement. If winners don't respond in time, I'll draw replacement winners. Good luck!